I stood in my small apartment, still wearing my VA hospital scrubs, holding a letter that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. My parents had drained my entire $6,800 college fund, money I'd saved from 3 deployments in Afghanistan, to buy my sister Madison a designer wardrobe for her Instagram influencer dreams. But what they didn't know was that this former Army medic had learned a thing or two about strategic warfare, and I was about to deploy every skill I'd acquired to take back everything they'd stolen from me. The envelope felt heavier than it should have as I tore it open with trembling fingers. St. Mary's University, the header read in bold blue letters. I'd been waiting for this, my acceptance letter for the nursing program I'd been dreaming about since my discharge 2 years ago. But instead of congratulations, the words that stared back at me made my blood run cold. Dear Ms. Rodriguez, your enrollment in the fall 2024 nursing program is in jeopardy due to unpaid tuition fees. Your account shows a balance of $6,800 that was due 3 weeks ago. If payment is not received within 10 business days, your spot will be forfeited to the next candidate on our waiting list. I read the letter 3 times, each pass making less sense than the last. My heart hammered against my ribs with the same intensity I'd felt during mortar attacks in Kandahar. This couldn't be right. I had saved every dollar from my deployment bonuses, every penny from the combat pay that came, with dodging IEDs and treating wounded soldiers in a field hospital. $6,800, carefully accumulated over 3 tours of duty, sitting in a dedicated education account that I'd set up specifically for this moment. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app. The Wi-Fi in my studio apartment was sluggish, and each second of loading felt like an eternity. When the screen finally refreshed, I stared at the numbers in disbelief. Account balance, $0. Available funds, $0. The room started spinning. I grabbed the edge of my kitchenette counter to steady myself, my knuckles white against the cheap laminate surface. This had to be some kind of mistake, a banking error, a system glitch. There was no way my college fund could just vanish. I'd been checking it religiously every month since my discharge, watching it grow, planning my future around those hard-earned dollars. With shaking fingers, I navigated to the transaction history. What I saw there made my stomach drop like a stone into an abyss. Charge after charge, all from the past 2 weeks. Nordstrom, $200. Sephora, $450. Apple Store, $800. Louis Vuitton, $100. Gucci, $950. The list went on and on, each purchase more expensive than the last, all adding up to exactly $6,800. But it was the location that made everything click into place with sickening clarity. All the transactions were made in Phoenix, Arizona, my hometown, where my parents lived, where my 22-year-old sister Madison still lived in their basement, despite having graduated college 2 years ago with a degree she'd never used. I sank onto my second-hand couch, the springs creaking under my weight. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around me. I'd chosen this place specifically because it was within walking distance of both the university and the VA hospital where I worked part-time as a medical technician. Every decision I'd made since coming home had been calculated, purposeful, aimed at building the life I'd dreamed about during those long nights in the desert. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 36 months in a war zone, dodging bullets and saving lives, only to be ambushed by my own family in the safety of civilian life. The enemy I'd trained to fight wore uniforms and carried weapons I could see. This betrayal came, wrapped in familiar voices and shared DNA. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced down to see Madison's name on the screen. The timing felt like a cruel joke. OMG, Alex, you have to see my new haul. Finally got the Birkin bag I've been wanting forever. Mom and Dad are the best. Attached was a photo of her posing in what looked like a luxury boutique dressing room, surrounded by shopping bags and boxes. She was wearing what appeared to be a brand new designer outfit, complete with shoes, that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The smile on her face was radiant, completely oblivious to the devastation she was flaunting. I stared at the image until my vision blurred. Every designer label in that photo represented hours of my life in Afghanistan. The purse alone was worth 2 weeks of combat pay. The shoes represented the nights I'd spent treating wounded soldiers while rockets exploded overhead. The jewelry was paid for with money I'd earned while missing birthdays, holidays, and every normal milestone of my early 20s. My throat felt tight as I scrolled through her Instagram feed. Post after post of new clothes, expensive makeup, designer accessories. Each photo was carefully staged, perfectly lit, accompanied by captions about living my best life and grateful for amazing parents. The timestamps showed they'd all been posted within the last 2 weeks, exactly when my money had been disappearing from my account. The comments under her posts made my jaw clench. Goals! Your parents are amazing. Living the dream. So lucky. If they only knew that her dream life was built on the sacrifice of someone who'd literally bled for her country, they might not be so quick with their admiration. I closed Instagram and opened my contacts, scrolling to my parents' number. My finger hovered over the call button for a long moment. Part of me wanted to believe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding that could make this all make sense. Maybe they'd borrowed the money for an emergency and planned to pay it back. Maybe Madison didn't know where the money had come from. Maybe they'd tried to call me and hadn't been able to reach me. But even as I tried to rationalize their actions, I knew better. I'd been in this family for 26 years. I knew exactly how these dynamics worked. Madison wanted something, and they gave it to her. Consequences be damned. It didn't matter that the money belonged to someone else. It didn't matter that it represented years of sacrifice and careful planning. What mattered was keeping their precious youngest daughter happy. The worst part was that I wasn't even surprised. Disappointed, devastated, betrayed, absolutely. But surprised? Not really. This was just the latest in a long pattern of behavior that stretched back to our childhood. Madison gets, Alex gives. Madison needs, Alex provides. Madison dreams, Alex sacrifices. I thought about calling the bank, reporting the charges as fraudulent. Technically, that's what they were. I'd never authorized anyone to access that account, never given permission for those purchases. But I also knew that my parents were listed as emergency contacts on the account, a precaution I'd set up before my deployments in case something happened to me overseas. They'd probably use that access to convince the bank they had the right to make withdrawals. The legal implications made my head spin. These weren't strangers who'd stolen my identity. These were my parents, people who were supposed to love and protect me, not rob me blind to fund their other daughter's shopping addiction. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound I'd treated in the field hospital. My apartment felt suffocating. Suddenly, I needed air, space, somewhere to think clearly. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, but stopped when I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. I looked exactly like what I was, a tired veteran still wearing scrubs. From a 10-hour shift, living paycheck to paycheck while trying to build something better. The contrast between my reality and Madison's Instagram perfect life couldn't have been starker. As I stood there, staring at my own exhausted face, something shifted inside me. The initial shock was fading, replaced by something colder and more calculating. I'd been trained to assess threats, develop strategies, and execute missions with precision. This situation was no different. My family had declared war on my future, and I wasn't about to surrender without a fight. They'd made a critical error in judgment. They'd assumed I was still the same pushover who'd always put family loyalty above personal needs. They'd forgotten that the Army had taught me more than just medical skills. I'd learned logistics, strategy, and most importantly, how to win. The 20-minute drive to my parents' house in Scottsdale felt like crossing enemy territory. Every familiar landmark along the way, the gas station where Dad used to buy me, candy after Little League games, the park where Mom taught me to ride a bike, now felt tainted by what I'd discovered. The modest ranch-style home looked exactly the same as always, with its desert landscaping and faded blue shutters, but I was seeing it through different eyes now. This wasn't the sanctuary of my childhood anymore. This was the headquarters of people who'd robbed me blind. I sat in my beat-up Honda Civic for a full minute, gripping the steering wheel and trying to center myself the way my Army therapist had taught me. Deep breaths. Stay focused. Don't let emotion cloud your judgment. But my hands were still trembling, with a mixture of rage and disbelief as I walked up the familiar brick pathway to the front door. The sound of laughter drifted through the windows, Madison's high-pitched giggle mixed with Mom's delighted squeals. I could hear them before I even rang the doorbell, their voices carrying the unmistakable excitement of a successful shopping expedition. The irony made my teeth clench. They were celebrating with my money, rejoicing in their theft like it was some kind of family victory. I didn't bother knocking. This was still technically my childhood home, and I had every right to walk through that door. The living room scene that greeted me was like something out of a nightmare. Shopping bags covered every surface, the coffee table, the couch, even the floor. Designer labels were scattered everywhere. Prada, Hermes, Chanel, brands that cost more than most people made in a month. Madison was sprawled on the carpet like a child on Christmas morning, surrounded by tissue paper and empty boxes. She was holding up a pair of shoes that looked like they cost more than my car payment, turning them this way and that to catch the light. Mom sat cross-legged beside her, equally entranced by the luxury goods spread around them like some kind of high-end treasure hunt. "Alexandra!" Mom's face lit up when she spotted me in the doorway. She scrambled to her feet with the enthusiasm of someone half her age. "Perfect timing! You have to see what Madison got today. We had the most amazing shopping day." The casual tone of her voice hit me like a physical blow. There was no guilt in her expression, no awareness that anything was wrong. She was genuinely excited to show me the evidence of their crime, as if I should be happy about it. Madison looked up from her position on the floor, her face glowing with the kind of joy that only came from unlimited spending. "Alex, oh my God! Wait until you see everything." Mom and Dad totally surprised me with this incredible shopping spree. I got the Birkin bag I've been wanting forever, and these Jimmy Choos, and this gorgeous Cartier bracelet, and where did the money come from? The words came out flat and emotionless, cutting through her enthusiasm like a blade. Madison blinked at me, confusion clouding her features. "What do you mean?" "Mom and Dad paid for everything. They said I deserved a treat since I've been working so hard on my influencer career." I almost laughed at that. Madison's idea of working hard involved taking selfies and posting them online. She'd never held a real job in her life, never paid rent, never gone without a meal, or wondered if she could afford groceries. The closest she'd come to hardship was when her iPhone screen cracked and she had to wait 3 whole days for a replacement. "Mom." I turned to face my mother directly, ignoring Madison's continued chatter about her purchases. I asked where the money came from. Something flickered in Mom's eyes, a brief shadow of uncertainty that was quickly replaced by defensive irritation. "I don't understand why you're being so hostile, Alexandra. We wanted to do something nice for your sister. She's been through a difficult time lately with her career transitions." Career transitions. That was their euphemism for Madison's complete inability to function as an adult. She'd been transitioning for 2 years now, living rent-free in their basement while pursuing her dream of becoming an Instagram influencer, a dream they enabled by funding her lifestyle and apparently her wardrobe too. The money came from my college fund. I kept my voice level, professional, the same tone I'd used when delivering bad news to families in the hospital. $6,800. My deployment savings. The money I earned in Afghanistan, The room went dead silent. Madison's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and then something that might have been shame if she were capable of feeling it. Mom's defensive posture shifted, her shoulders squaring like she was preparing for battle. "Now, hold on just a minute," Mom said, her voice taking on the sharp edge I remembered from childhood arguments. "That money was sitting in an account doing nothing. Madison needed clothes for her career, and we knew you'd understand once you saw how happy it made her." The casual dismissal of my sacrifice hit me like a slap. Doing nothing. 3 years of combat pay, hazard duty pay, separation allowances earned while I treated wounded soldiers and dodged rocket attacks was doing nothing to her. "I was saving that money for nursing school," I said, my voice still eerily calm. "My tuition payment was due 3 weeks ago. I'm going to lose my spot in the program because you stole my education fund to buy purses." "We didn't steal anything," Dad's voice came from the kitchen doorway. He was holding a beer and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd just solved a problem. "We're your parents. That makes us responsible for making decisions about family resources." Family resources. My combat pay was now a family resource. The money I'd earned while serving my country, while risking my life, while missing every family gathering and holiday for 3 years, was somehow communal property in their minds. Madison finally found her voice again. "Alex, I had no idea it was your money. Mom and Dad just said they wanted to treat me to a shopping day. If I had known—" "You would have what?" I interrupted. "Said no? Turned down thousands of dollars worth of designer goods? When have you ever said no to anything they've offered you?" She opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. We both knew the answer to that question. Madison had never turned down anything in her life. She'd grown up believing the world owed her whatever she wanted, and our parents had spent 22 years reinforcing that belief. "This is ridiculous," Mom said, waving her hand dismissively at the shopping bags around us. "You're acting like we committed some terrible crime. We're family. Family helps each other out. You've always been the responsible one, Alexandra. You'll find another way to pay for school." The responsible one. There it was, the label that had defined my entire life in this house. Alexandra the responsible one. Alexandra the problem solver. Alexandra the one who could handle anything, who would always figure it out, who never needed help or support or consideration because she was just naturally capable of handling whatever life threw at her. "I'll find another way," I repeated slowly. "Like I found a way to pay for my own car when I was 16. Like I found a way to pay for my own college applications when Madison needed new gymnastics equipment. Like I found a way to send money home during my deployments to help with your mortgage payments." Dad's face flushed red. "That's different. We never asked you to—" "You never asked because you never had to ask. You just took. You've been taking from me my entire life, and I let you because I thought that's what family meant. But this?" I gestured at the shopping bags surrounding us. "This isn't family. This is theft." Madison scrambled to her feet, designer shoes still clutched in her hands. "Alex, please don't be mad. Maybe I can return some of this stuff. Would that help?" The offer would have been touching if it hadn't come 3 weeks too late. If she'd made it before my tuition deadline passed, if it hadn't been delivered while she was literally surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal. "Madison, you posted pictures of that Birkin bag on Instagram 2 weeks ago," I said quietly. "You've been bragging about this shopping spree online while I was getting letters from the university threatening to drop me from the program. So no, returning some of this stuff wouldn't help." Mom's expression hardened into the familiar mask of righteous indignation she wore whenever anyone questioned her decisions. "I don't appreciate your tone, young lady. We raised you better than this. Family comes first, and sometimes that means making sacrifices. Madison needed this more than you needed that money sitting in an account. Needed. Madison needed a $6,000 purse more than I needed an education. Madison needed designer shoes more than I needed the career I'd been planning since My discharge. Madison needed to maintain her Instagram lifestyle more than I needed to build a future beyond the VA hospital. I looked around the room one more time, taking in the scene like I was documenting evidence. Madison clutching her expensive shoes with tears starting to form in her eyes. Mom standing with her arms crossed, defensive and unrepentant. Dad lurking in the doorway, already mentally preparing his escape from the confrontation. And everywhere, scattered across every surface, the designer goods they'd purchased with my future. "You're right about one thing," I said finally. "Family does come first. I'm just not sure we have the same definition of family." The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, looking at their faces, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. To them, I wasn't family. I was a resource, a problem solver, a bank account with legs. And now that I'd served my purpose, they expected me to smile and pretend everything was fine. But I wasn't the same person who'd left for Afghanistan 3 years ago. The Army had taught me about loyalty, about honor, about what it really meant to have someone's back. And none of what I'd learned included funding shopping sprees for people who didn't even acknowledge your sacrifice. The drive back to my apartment passed in a blur of desert highways and neon signs, but my mind was spinning through memories like a broken film reel. Sitting in traffic at a red light, I found myself remembering the Christmas when I was 12 and Madison was 8. I'd saved every penny from my paper route for 3 months to buy Mom and Dad a nice coffee maker, the kind with the programmable timer that Dad had mentioned wanting. Madison had grabbed a clearance scarf from the drugstore checkout line the day before Christmas, spending maybe $5 of allowance money she hadn't earned. Guess whose gift they opened first? Guess whose gift made them tear up with gratitude? Madison's thoughtless last-minute purchase was so sweet and showed such consideration, while my coffee maker was acknowledged with a distracted, "Thanks, honey," before they moved on to fawning over Madison's every breath. The pattern had been there all along, woven so deeply into our family fabric that I'd stopped seeing it as abnormal. I was the giver, the responsible one, the child who never needed attention or praise because I was naturally mature. Madison was the receiver, the delicate flower who needed constant nurturing and financial support because she was still finding herself. I remembered being 14 when Madison wanted to join an elite gymnastics program that cost $300 a month. My parents agonized over the expense for exactly one dinner conversation before deciding it was an investment in her future. When I asked about violin lessons the same week, something I'd been wanting for years, Dad explained that we could only afford one extracurricular activity, and Madison's was more important because she had real talent. I'd been playing guitar by ear since I was 10, teaching myself songs from YouTube videos and library books. But apparently that didn't count as real talent, because I'd never asked them to pay for it. The summer I turned 16, I'd finally saved enough from my job at the local diner to buy a used car. Nothing fancy. A beat-up Toyota Corolla with dents in the bumper and a radio that only worked half the time. But it was mine, bought with grease-stained dollars earned during long shifts flipping burgers and taking orders from demanding customers. 2 weeks after I bought it, Madison decided she absolutely had to have a car too. She was only 14. Couldn't even drive legally, but she'd seen mine and suddenly transportation was a necessity. Within a month, my parents had financed a brand new Honda Civic for her to grow into. They explained it by saying they wanted her to have something reliable and safe, unlike my death trap that could break down at any moment. When my Corolla actually did break down 6 months later, a timing belt that would cost more to fix than the car was worth, they shrugged and said it proved their point. I spent my senior year of high school walking to my job at the diner, saving every penny to fix my car, while Madison's Honda sat unused in the driveway because she'd lost interest in learning to drive. The memories kept flooding back as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. High school graduation, when Madison threw such a fit about not being the center of attention that Mom spent the entire reception apologizing to her for not making it about both girls. College application season, when they paid for Madison's SAT prep courses and college visits, but told me I was smart enough to figure it out on my own. I'd been so proud when I got accepted to Arizona State with a partial scholarship. It wasn't the full ride I'd hoped for, but combined with my savings from working double shifts at the diner, I thought I could make it work. That pride lasted. Exactly until Madison got rejected from her dream school and went into one of her dramatic meltdowns. Suddenly, my college plans were putting too much financial pressure on the family. Wouldn't it be more responsible for me to take a gap year, maybe work full-time and help save money for Madison's second-choice school? They never directly asked me to give up my spot, but the pressure was constant and suffocating. In the end, joining the Army had felt like the only way to escape without completely destroying the family dynamics. The irony wasn't lost on me now. I'd enlisted partly to get away from being the family's financial safety net, only to end up sending money home anyway during my deployments. Every month, like clockwork, I'd transferred money to help with their mortgage, their car payments, their credit card bills. They never asked directly, but Mom would call with updates about their temporary financial stress, and Dad would mention in passing how proud they were of my military salary. I'd told myself it was my way of contributing to the family, of showing that I cared even from thousands of miles away. But looking back, I could see it for what it really was, the same pattern that had defined my entire childhood. Alex gives, everyone else receives. Alex sacrifices, everyone else benefits. The most painful memories surfaced as I sat on my couch, still wearing my hospital scrubs. It was during my second deployment, after a particularly brutal month where we'd lost 3 soldiers in my unit. I'd been struggling with nightmares and anxiety, finally working up the courage to call home and actually talk about what I was going through. I'd reached Mom on a Tuesday evening, Arizona time. The connection was terrible, crackling with static. But I'd managed to explain that I was having a hard time and needed to hear some familiar voices, needed to feel connected to home. Mom had listened for maybe 3 minutes before interrupting to tell me about Madison's latest crisis. She'd dropped out of her 3rd college major, communications this time, and was considering a gap year to find her passion. Did I think Madison could come visit me on base? It might be good for her to see how other people lived. Maybe give her some perspective on her own problems. Even in my emotionally vulnerable state, I'd recognized the absurdity. Madison visiting a combat zone to gain perspective. Madison, who cried when her favorite restaurant changed their menu, somehow finding enlightenment in a forward operating base where mortars fell like rain. I'd ended that call feeling more isolated than before I'd made it. My combat stress was less important than Madison's college indecision. My nightmares about IEDs and casualty reports were secondary to her need for perspective. Even from a war zone, I was expected to be the strong, the problem solver, the daughter who could handle anything. The worst part was how normal it had all seemed at the time. I'd grown up believing that this was just how families worked. The responsible child takes care of everyone else's needs. The reliable daughter ensures everyone else's happiness. It wasn't until I started talking to other soldiers about their families that I realized how skewed my perception had become. My battle buddy Sarah used to get care packages from home every month, cookies, magazines, letters from aunts and cousins and family friends. When I mentioned that I never got packages, she looked at me like I'd said I didn't believe in gravity. Never? She'd asked. Not even on holidays? I'd explained that my family wasn't really the care package type, that they preferred to support me financially instead. Sarah had pressed for details, and I'd found myself describing the monthly money transfers I made home. The way her expression changed, from confusion to concern to outright anger, was the first time I'd seen my family dynamics reflected through someone else's eyes. Alex, she'd said carefully. That's backwards. You're supposed to be getting support from home, not providing it. But by then, the pattern was so ingrained that I couldn't imagine any other way. My family needed me to be strong, reliable, financially helpful. That was my role, my identity, my value to them. The idea of being a daughter who received instead of gave felt foreign and uncomfortable. Even my decision to pursue nursing after my discharge had been filtered through their needs. When I'd mentioned wanting to study medicine, Dad had immediately started talking about how much money I could make as a nurse practitioner, how I could help support the family even better with that kind of salary. Not once had he asked if it was something I actually wanted to do, if it aligned with my interests or goals. Now, sitting in my small apartment with the devastating reality of their betrayal fresh in my mind, I could see the full scope of what they'd stolen from me. It wasn't just the $6,800, though that was devastating enough. They'd stolen my ability to trust, my sense of family loyalty, my belief that I mattered to them as anything more than a resource. But perhaps most importantly, they'd revealed something I'd been refusing to acknowledge for years. This wasn't a family where love was unconditional or support flowed both ways. This was a carefully constructed hierarchy where Madison's wants trumped everyone else's needs, where my sacrifices were not only expected, but invisible, where my value was measured entirely by what I could provide. The realization should have been crushing. Instead, it felt like waking up from a long, confusing dream. For the first time in my adult life, I could see my family clearly, without the filter of obligation or guilt. And what I saw was a system that had been designed to use me, one that would continue using me for as long as I allowed it. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, which had become my norm since returning from deployment. My body still operated on military time, even 2 years later. But instead of the usual grogginess that accompanied my early wake-ups, I felt strangely alert, like my mind had been working through problems while I slept. I made coffee in the single cup maker I'd bought secondhand and sat at my small kitchen table, staring out the window at the Phoenix skyline. For 26 years, I'd accepted my role in this family without question. I was Alexandra the dependable one, Alexandra the fixer. Alexandra who never complained, never asked for help, never required the kind of emotional maintenance that Madison seemed to need constantly. It had become such a fundamental part of my identity that I'd never stopped to examine what it actually meant or what it cost me. In the Army, we had a term for soldiers who consistently put the mission and their unit above their own needs. We called them force multipliers. They made everyone around them better, stronger, more capable. It was meant as the highest compliment, recognition that you were the kind of person others could count on when everything went to hell. But sitting there in my civilian kitchen, I realized that being the family force multiplier had meant something entirely different. It hadn't made my family stronger or more capable. Instead, it had enabled them to remain weak, dependent, and completely self-centered. My reliability had become their excuse for irresponsibility. My strength had become their justification for weakness. I thought about Madison, 22 years old and still living in our parents' basement. She'd graduated from Arizona State 2 years ago with a degree in marketing that she'd never used. Instead, she'd moved back home and declared herself an entrepreneur, focused on building her social media presence. Our parents had embraced this delusion completely, treating her Instagram posts like a legitimate career and funding her lifestyle as if she were a startup they were investing in. The math was staggering when I really thought about it. Madison had been living rent-free for 2 years, eating their food, using their utilities, driving their cars. They'd paid for her phone plan, her gym membership, her streaming subscriptions, her clothes, her makeup, her regular spa treatments. Now, I could add $6,800 in luxury shopping to that list. Meanwhile, I'd been paying my own rent, buying my own groceries, covering my own insurance, and somehow still finding money to send home every month to help with their bills. The disparity was so extreme it would have been laughable if it wasn't so devastatingly real. I'd always justified it by telling myself that Madison was younger, still figuring herself out, still learning to be an adult. But she wasn't 18 anymore. She was a college graduate who'd had 2 years to figure out some kind of path forward. Instead, she'd chosen to retreat further into childhood, and our parents had not only allowed it, but encouraged it. The more I examined our family dynamics, the more I realized how carefully constructed they were. It wasn't accidental that I'd been designated the responsible one while Madison got to be the cherished baby. These roles had been assigned and reinforced through thousands of small interactions over the years. When Madison threw tantrums as a child, she got comfort and accommodation. When I showed distress, I got lectures about being mature and setting a good example. When Madison made mistakes, they were learning experiences that required support and understanding. When I made mistakes, they were character flaws that needed to be corrected immediately. Madison's needs were always urgent and legitimate. My needs were optional and could be delayed indefinitely. Madison's emotions were valid and required immediate attention. My emotions were inconvenient disruptions that needed to be managed quietly. I remembered the summer I was 15, working at the diner to save money for a school trip to Washington, D.C. I'd been planning it for months, calculating exactly how many shifts I'd need to work to afford the airfare and hotel costs. Madison, who was 11 at the time, decided that same summer that she absolutely had to go to cheer camp. The camp cost exactly what I'd saved for my trip. Our parents agonized over the decision for about 30 seconds before explaining that Madison's cheer camp was an investment in her social development, while my school trip was just tourism. They used my Washington, D.C. money to send Madison to camp, promising they'd help me find another way to afford the trip. That other way never materialized. I spent that summer working double shifts at the diner, watching my classmates post photos from D.C., while Madison posted photos from cheer camp using the money I'd earned. When school started, and my teacher asked why I hadn't participated in the trip, I lied and said I'd chosen to work instead. It was easier than explaining that my family had deemed my educational experience less valuable than my sister's recreational activities. The pattern continued through high school. When Madison wanted expensive art supplies for a class she'd eventually drop, they found the money immediately. When I needed textbooks for my advanced placement courses, I was told to check them out from the library or find used copies online. When Madison wanted to redecorate her room for the 3rd time in 2 years, they hired a professional decorator. When I asked if we could repaint my room that hadn't been updated since middle school, I was handed a paintbrush and told I could do it myself if it was important to me. College had been the ultimate example of this disparity. Madison's college experience was fully funded. Tuition, room and board, meal plans, spending money, spring break trips, sorority dues. She'd graduated debt-free with a degree she had no intention of using, immediately moving back home to pursue her influencer dreams. My college experience was conditional from the start. I could go if I could pay for it. I could study what I wanted as long as it led to immediate financial returns. I could live on campus if I could afford it, otherwise I should commute to save money. Every aspect of my education was filtered through a cost-benefit analysis that was never applied to Madison's choices. Joining the Army had actually been a relief in some ways. For the first time in my life, I was part of a system where merit mattered more than birth order, where your value was determined by your contributions, not your ability to cry on command, where being reliable and competent was rewarded rather than exploited. My fellow soldiers had become the first real family I'd ever known. Sarah, who sent me care packages and remembered my birthday. Marcus, who taught me to play poker and listened when I needed to vent about difficult missions. Lieutenant Rodriguez, who wrote recommendation letters for my college applications and helped me plan my post-military career. They'd shown me what healthy relationships looked like: reciprocal, supportive, based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. When Sarah was struggling with anxiety, we all pitched in to support her. When Marcus lost his grandmother, we covered his duties so he could go home for the funeral. When I was having financial stress, they helped me create a budget and find resources. It was everything my biological family had never been. People who saw my needs as valid, my emotions as legitimate, my goals as worth supporting. People who valued my contributions without taking them for granted. Coming home to Phoenix after my discharge had been jarring. Within a week, I was back to being Alexandra the family ATM. Mom called with updates about their financial stress. Dad mentioned how proud they were of my military savings. Madison complained about needing new clothes for her career. The expectation that I would resume my role as the family's financial safety net was so automatic, they didn't even bother to ask directly. I'd fallen right back into the pattern because it felt normal, familiar, the way things had always been. But now, sitting in my apartment with the evidence of their ultimate betrayal fresh in my mind, I could see how thoroughly they'd conditioned me to accept my exploitation as love. They'd taught me that my value lay in what I could provide, not who I was. They'd convinced me that love meant endless giving without expectation of return. They'd made me believe that asking for support or prioritizing my own needs was selfish and wrong. But the Army had taught me something different. It had shown me that real love and loyalty were reciprocal, that healthy relationships involved mutual support and respect, that being valued meant being seen as a whole person, not just a resource to be exploited. The contrast was so stark it was almost funny. My military family had supported my goals, celebrated my achievements, and helped me plan for my future. My biological family had stolen my future to fund a shopping spree. The choice between these two versions of family wasn't really a choice at all. I didn't sleep that second night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, writing down numbers with the methodical precision I'd learned during inventory duties in the Army. Every dollar I'd sent home over the past 2 years. Every expense I'd covered for them. Every sacrifice I'd made while they lived comfortably on my deployment's earnings. The final tally was devastating. $18,140. Nearly $20,000 I'd transferred to them since my discharge, money that was supposed to help with temporary financial difficulties that somehow never seemed to resolve. Money that had apparently freed up their budget enough to afford a $6,000 shopping spree for Madison without breaking stride. But it wasn't the financial theft that broke something inside me that night. It was the realization of how completely they'd played me. Every phone call filled with worry about bills, every mention of mounting credit card debt, every casual reference to their pride in my military salary. It had all been manipulation, carefully crafted to keep the money flowing from my account to theirs. I thought about Marcus, my old squad mate who'd warned me about families that saw military paychecks as their personal windfall. "You gotta watch out for the takers," he'd said during one of our late-night conversations in Afghanistan. "Some families think your combat pay is their lottery ticket." I'd laughed it off at the time, certain my family wasn't like that. They loved me. They were proud of me. They just needed a little help getting back on their feet. What a fool I'd been. The breaking point wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming, no throwing things, no explosive confrontation with myself in the mirror. It was quieter than that, more profound. It was the simple recognition that I had been living my entire life for people who saw me as a resource rather than a daughter. People who measured my worth by my utility rather than my humanity. I'd spent 26 years trying to earn their love through sacrifice, convinced that if I just gave enough, did enough, proved myself reliable enough, they would eventually see me the way they saw Madison. But the shopping spree had revealed the truth I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. There was no amount of giving that would ever make me the chosen daughter. That role belonged to Madison permanently, and mine was to fund it. The silence in my apartment felt different now. Not lonely or oppressive, but clean. Like the silence after a difficult surgery when you've finally removed something toxic that was poisoning the whole system. I could breathe deeper than I had in years. I opened my laptop and began methodically severing the financial ties that had bound me to them. First, I removed their access to my bank accounts. They'd been listed as emergency contacts since before my first deployment, a precaution I'd thought was responsible in case something happened to me overseas. That access had clearly been abused, and it ended now. Next, I changed every password they might have known. Banking, credit cards, investment accounts, even my Netflix subscription that Madison had been using. Each click felt like cutting a rope that had been strangling me slowly for years. The credit cards were more complicated. They were co-signers on 2 of them, cards I'd opened during my early military days when I was building credit. I couldn't simply remove them, but I could freeze the accounts and request new cards with different numbers. I spent an hour on hold with customer service representatives, explaining that I needed to secure my accounts due to unauthorized usage. "Has your identity been stolen, ma'am?" the Visa representative asked. I paused, considering the question. Had my identity been stolen? In the most literal sense, yes. The person they thought I was, the endlessly giving daughter who would always put family first, had been stolen from me by people who'd convinced me that's who I should be. But the person I actually was, the person I was choosing to become, was taking that identity back. "Yes," I told the representative, "it has been." While I waited for new cards to arrive, I drafted a letter to my parents. Not an emotional plea or angry confrontation, but a business-like document outlining the financial support I'd provided over the past 2 years and formally notifying them that it was ending immediately. I included copies of bank statements and transfer records, itemizing every dollar with the same attention to detail I'd used for military supply requisitions. The letter wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about clarity. They'd operated under the assumption that my money was their safety net, that my sacrifice was their entitlement. They needed to understand that this assumption was incorrect and would no longer govern our relationship. I thought about calling Sarah, my old battle buddy who'd become one of my closest friends since we'd both separated from the Army. She was stationed at Fort Hood now, pursuing her degree in engineering while serving in the National Guard. We'd stayed in touch through text messages and occasional video calls, but I hadn't told her about my family situation. Military friendships were built on mutual support, and I'd been too embarrassed to admit that my own family was exploiting me. But sitting there in the 3 a.m. darkness of my apartment, I realized that shame was just another tool they'd used to keep me isolated and compliant. They'd trained me to see my exploitation as normal, my boundaries as selfish, my needs as secondary. The shame I felt about their behavior was actually shame they should have been carrying. I picked up my phone and typed a message to Sarah. "Are you awake? I need to talk to someone who understands what real loyalty looks like." Her response came within minutes. "Always awake for you. What's going on?" I spent the next hour typing out the whole story, from the tuition letter to the shopping spree to the financial records I'd been compiling. Sarah's responses evolved from shock to outrage to something that sounded like relief. "Jesus, Alex," she wrote after I'd finished. "I've been wondering for 2 years why you always seemed so stressed about money when I knew you were working and living simply. This explains everything." "You noticed?" "Of course I noticed. You're one of the most financially responsible people." "I know, but you always seemed worried about bills and never seemed to have any savings despite working constantly. I thought maybe you had medical expenses or student loans you hadn't mentioned." The validation hit me harder than I'd expected. Sarah had seen the signs that something was wrong, even when I'd been blind to them myself. She'd noticed my stress, my financial struggles, my inability to build the kind of stability that should have come naturally to someone with my income and spending habits. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I looked around my small apartment, taking inventory of my life with fresh eyes. I had a job at the VA hospital that paid decently and aligned with my values. I had a small but solid group of friends from my military service who actually cared about my well-being. I had skills, education benefits, and for the first time in my adult life, I would have control over my own money. I'm going to build something they can't take away from me, I typed back. Good, Sarah responded immediately. You deserve so much, better than how they've treated you. And Alex? That family that raised you isn't your real family anyway. Your real family is the people who would never steal from you, who celebrate your successes instead of exploiting them, who see your strength as something to support rather than something to drain. I stared at her message for a long time, feeling something shift inside my chest. She was right. I'd been so focused on trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it that I'd missed the real love that was already in my life. Sarah, Marcus, Lieutenant Rodriguez, my co-workers at the hospital who'd become genuine friends, they were my real family. They were the people who saw my value as a person rather than a resource. The apartment felt different when I finally closed my laptop, lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying invisible weight that had suddenly been lifted. I wasn't the same woman who'd opened that tuition letter 3 days ago. That woman had been trapped in a prison of other people's expectations, convinced that her worth was measured by her willingness to sacrifice. This woman was free. I walked to my bedroom and opened the closet where I kept my dress uniform. It was pressed and ready, the way I maintained it out of habit, even though I rarely had occasion to wear it. But looking at it now, I remembered what it represented. Honor, courage, commitment, values that had nothing to do with being useful to people who didn't respect you. I'd learned those values in the Army, but I'd forgotten to apply them to my civilian life. I'd let my family treat me with dishonor, shown cowardice in the face of their manipulation, and compromised my commitment to my own well-being. That ended now. I wasn't going to be angry about their betrayal. Anger was what they expected, what they were prepared to handle. They knew how to deflect anger, how to turn it back on me as evidence of my selfishness and ingratitude. But they weren't prepared for something else entirely: my complete withdrawal from their system of exploitation. Was done being the family's backup plan, safety net, and emotional support animal. Done subsidizing Madison's lifestyle while she played pretend entrepreneur. Done enabling my parents' financial irresponsibility by covering the consequences of their choices. From now on, my energy, my money, and my loyalty would go to people who valued them appropriately. People who understood that real love was reciprocal, that real family supported each other's growth rather than draining each other's resources. I was finally ready to choose myself. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time. Since I'd started at the VA hospital, it wasn't entirely a lie. I felt hollowed out, like I was recovering from surgery that had removed something fundamental from my core. But I also needed time to handle the logistics of my new life, and I couldn't do that while pretending everything was normal during my 12-hour shift. I started with the most practical concerns. My lease was up for renewal in 3 months, and I'd been planning to find a cheaper place to help manage my finances better. Now I realized those tight finances hadn't been due to Phoenix's cost of living. They'd been due to subsidizing my family's lifestyle with monthly transfers I'd convinced myself were temporary. Without those transfers, my income was actually quite comfortable. I could afford a better apartment, maybe even start building the kind of emergency fund that Madison had just blown on handbags. The realization was both liberating and infuriating. I'd been living like a broke college student while my family lived like I was their personal trust fund. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Alexandra, your father and I need to talk to you. Can you come by the house this evening? There seems to be some confusion about your accounts." Confusion. That was their word for my decision to protect my money from further theft. I deleted the message without responding and blocked their number. If they wanted to communicate with me, they could do it the way adults communicated with other adults, through email or written letters that gave me time to think before responding. The silence felt strange. No text notifications from Mom updating me on family drama. No calls from Dad asking for financial advice that was really a prelude to asking for money. No messages from Madison showing off her latest purchases or complaining about her various first-world problems. For the first time in years, my phone was actually quiet. I spent the afternoon researching apartments in better neighborhoods, places with actual amenities like fitness centers and pools. Places where I could build the kind of life I'd been dreaming about since my discharge. Every listing I looked at felt like a small act of rebellion against the cramped, bare-bones existence I'd been maintaining while sending hundreds of dollars home each month. Around 3 p.m., I drove to the university to speak with someone in the financial aid office. I'd been avoiding this conversation, too embarrassed to admit that my family had stolen my tuition money, but shame was a luxury I could no longer afford. If there was any way to salvage my spot in the nursing program, I needed to explore it. Now. The financial aid counselor, Mrs. Chen, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every possible sob story. I explained my situation without emotion, sticking to the facts. My family had unauthorized access to my education fund. The money was gone. I needed to know if there were any options for late enrollment or deferred payment plans. "This isn't as uncommon as you might think," she said gently. "Family financial abuse happens more often than people realize, especially with military veterans. Your service record and previous academic performance are excellent. Let me see what we can do." She spent 30 minutes making phone calls and reviewing my file. The nursing program had a waiting list of qualified candidates, but my spot hadn't been officially forfeited, yet due to a recent policy change that allowed a grace period for financial emergencies. If I could demonstrate ability to pay within the next 2 weeks, they could hold my place. "The challenge is the amount," Mrs. Chen explained. $6,800 is substantial for a short-term payment plan. Do you have any other resources, family members who could co-sign a loan? I almost laughed at that suggestion. "No family resources," I said firmly. "But I do have my GI Bill benefits. Can those be accelerated or supplemented?" We spent another hour going through my options. There was the Emergency Hardship Fund for veterans, several grants I hadn't known about, and the possibility of a work-study position that could offset some costs. Combined with a small private loan, it might be enough. "It won't be easy," Mrs. Chen warned. "You'll be working while going to school full-time, and the loan payments will be tight. But it's doable if you're committed." "I'm committed," I said, without hesitation. This was my chance to build something they couldn't take away from me, and I wasn't going to let it slip by. I left the university with a stack of paperwork and a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in days. It would be difficult, but difficult was familiar territory. I'd managed medical emergencies in combat zones. I could handle balancing work and school while managing loan payments. On the drive home, I stopped at a storage unit facility and rented a small space. If my family decided to escalate their attempts to contact me, I wanted my important documents and belongings somewhere they couldn't access. My birth certificate, social security card, military records, and discharge paperwork went into a fireproof box in the storage unit, along with a few sentimental items I'd accumulated during my service. The act of securing my documents felt symbolic. These papers represented my identity, my achievements, my proof of service and citizenship. They belonged to me, not to people who saw me as a resource to be exploited. Back at my apartment, I found an envelope slipped under my door. My mother's handwriting on cream-colored stationery that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won out. "Alexandra," it began, "your father and I are very concerned about your recent behavior. Blocking our phone numbers and changing your account passwords is extreme and hurtful. We understand you're upset about the money, but family finances are complicated, and you've always been mature enough to understand that sometimes sacrifices are necessary." Sacrifices. Always my sacrifices, never theirs. The letter continued for 2 pages, hitting every manipulation tactic they'd perfected over the years. I was being dramatic. I was hurting Madison's feelings. I was destroying the family over money, which proved I'd lost sight of what really mattered. They'd raised me better than this. They were disappointed in the person I'd become. The final paragraph was the most revealing. We know you'll come to your senses and realize that family is more important than money. Madison is very upset and has been crying since you stormed out. She's young and didn't understand the implications of accepting those gifts. Surely you can find it in your heart to forgive a mistake and help us work through this difficult time. Madison was upset. Madison was crying. Madison didn't understand. Even in their apology letter, Madison's feelings were the priority. My stolen future was less important than her momentary discomfort at being held accountable for her actions. Folded the letter carefully and placed it in a file folder I labeled Documentation. If this situation escalated to legal action, I wanted a record of their attempts to manipulate me back into compliance. The evening passed quietly. No emergency calls about family crises that required my intervention. No requests for financial advice or assistance. No updates about Madison's latest drama or achievements that I was expected to celebrate despite my own struggles. Instead, I made dinner for one person and ate it while reading nursing textbooks I'd bought secondhand months ago. I watched a movie I'd been wanting to see without interruption. I went to bed at a reasonable hour without staying up late to manage someone else's emotional crisis or financial emergency. It was the most peaceful evening I'd had in years. I woke up the next morning with a clarity that felt almost physical, like someone had cleaned glasses I hadn't realized were dirty. The apartment that had felt cramped and temporary now felt like a sanctuary. My life that had felt chaotic and financially unstable now felt manageable and full of potential. The difference wasn't in my circumstances. Those were largely the same as they'd been a week ago. The difference was in my understanding of who controlled those circumstances. For the first time since my discharge from the Army, I was the only person making decisions about my money, my time, and my future. It felt like coming home to myself. 3 weeks into my new life of financial independence, I had fallen into a rhythm that felt both foreign and natural. My morning routine now included checking my bank account balance, not out of anxiety about what might have been taken, but out of satisfaction at watching my savings actually grow. For the first time since my discharge, I was living on my own money, and the difference was staggering. I'd submitted all the paperwork for the Emergency Hardship Fund and taken out a small student loan to cover my tuition. The payments would be tight, but manageable now that I wasn't hemorrhaging hundreds of dollars each month to my family's lifestyle. Mrs. Chen had called to confirm my spot in the nursing program was secure, and I'd registered for classes that would start in 6 weeks. The work-study position she'd mentioned turned out to be perfect for my background, assisting in the university's Veteran Services Office, helping other former military students navigate their transitions to civilian education. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now helping other veterans avoid the kind of family financial exploitation I'd been too blind to recognize in my own life. My new apartment search had yielded results, too. I'd found a 1-bedroom unit in a complex with a gym and a pool, about 15 minutes closer to both the university and the VA hospital. The rent was actually less than what I'd been paying when you factored in the monthly family subsidies I was no longer providing. I'd signed the lease and would move in at the end of the month. But my family wasn't content to let me disappear quietly. The escalation started small. Calls to my workplace that I didn't take. Letters slipped under my door that I filed away unread. Messages passed through mutual acquaintances asking me to come home and work things out. I ignored all of it, maintaining the boundary I'd established with the same discipline I'd learned in the military. Then Madison showed up at the VA hospital. I was coming off a particularly difficult shift in the emergency department when I spotted her in the waiting area, dressed in one of the outfits she'd bought with my tuition money. She looked out of place among the veterans and their families, her designer clothes and perfect makeup a stark contrast to the utilitarian environment of the medical center. "Alex?" She jumped up when she saw me, her voice carrying that practiced sweetness she used when she wanted something. "Thank God I found you. We need to talk." "No, we don't." I didn't slow down as I headed for the exit, my hospital badge still clipped to my scrubs. "And you need to leave. This is a medical facility, not a place for family drama." "Alex, please." She hurried to keep up with my pace, her expensive heels clicking on the polished floors. "Mom and Dad are worried sick about you. We all are. This silent treatment has gone on long enough." I stopped walking and turned to face her, noting how several staff members were starting to watch our interaction. This was exactly the kind of scene I'd been trying to avoid, and she'd deliberately chosen a location where I couldn't simply walk away without causing a disruption. "Madison, I'm going to say this once, and I need you to listen carefully," I said, keeping my voice low and professional. "You and our parents spent my college fund on designer clothes and accessories. Money I earned in a combat zone, money I saved for my education, money that represented my future. That wasn't a family decision or a misunderstanding. It was theft." Her face crumpled into the expression of wounded innocence she'd perfected in childhood. "I didn't know it was your money, Alex. If I had known, I never would have accepted those gifts. You have to believe me. You posted about those purchases on Instagram for 2 weeks before my tuition payment was due," I replied calmly. "You knew I was starting school because I talked about it at Easter dinner. You chose not to connect the dots because it was convenient not to." "That's not fair," she protested, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I'm not good with money stuff, like you are. I don't understand how bank accounts and college payments work. I just thought Mom and Dad had saved up for a shopping day." The victim act that might have worked on me 6 months ago now felt transparent and insulting. Madison was a college graduate, not a child. She understood money well enough to spend it on luxury goods. She understood social media well enough to monetize her Instagram presence. She understood family dynamics well enough to manipulate our parents into funding her lifestyle. What she didn't understand was accountability, and I was no longer interested in protecting her from the consequences of her choices. "Madison, you're 22 years old," I said. "You have a college degree and you live in the information age. Claiming ignorance about where $6,000 came from isn't credible. But even if it were true, it doesn't change the fact that the money is gone and my education was jeopardized because of it. We can fix this," she said desperately. "I can return some of the stuff I bought. Maybe not all of it, because I already wore some of the clothes and posted about them. But I could return the purse and the jewelry. Would that help?" The offer was too little, too late, but it also revealed how completely she misunderstood the situation. This wasn't about recovering the money anymore. I'd found other ways to pay for school. This was about the fundamental breach of trust, the casual disregard for my future, the assumption that my sacrifices were acceptable collateral damage for her happiness. "The damage is already done," I told her. "I've had to take out loans and work extra hours to replace the money you spent. But more importantly, I've learned something about our family that I can't unknow." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I finally understand my role in this family. I'm not the daughter. I'm the ATM. I'm not the sister. I'm the safety net. My value to all of you is based entirely on what I can provide, not who I am." Madison's tears were flowing freely now, and I could see several of my coworkers starting to approach, concerned about the emotional scene playing out in their workplace. I needed to end this conversation before it escalated further. "Alex, that's not true," Madison said, her voice breaking. "We love you. Your family. You're the most important person in our lives." "If that were true, you would have asked before. Spending my education fund," I replied. "If that were true, Mom and Dad would have considered how their decision would affect my future." If that were true, this conversation would have happened 3 weeks ago when you realized what had been done. They're afraid to call you, she admitted. They don't know what to say. They know they messed up, but they don't know how to fix it. They messed up? I repeated. Madison, they didn't accidentally spill something or forget an appointment. They deliberately took money that didn't belong to them and spent it on luxury goods for you. There's a legal term for that, and it's not messing up. The word legal seemed to register with her for the first time, and her expression shifted from hurt to alarm. Alex, you're not going to… you wouldn't really… would you? I didn't answer directly. Let her and my parents wonder about the legal implications of their actions. Let them consider the possibility that their behavior had consequences beyond my hurt feelings and disappointed silence. I need you to leave now, I said instead. And I need you to tell Mom and Dad that showing up at my workplace is not acceptable. If they want to communicate with me, they can do it in writing. Alex, please don't do this, Madison called as I turned to walk away. Don't destroy our family over money. We can work this out if you just come home and talk to us. I paused at the exit doors and looked back at her one last time. She was standing in the middle of the waiting area in her stolen designer outfit, crying because someone was finally holding her accountable for her actions. It was probably the first time in her adult life that her tears hadn't immediately solved her problems. Madison, I said quietly, I'm not destroying our family. I'm just refusing to fund it anymore. The automatic doors closed behind me, and I walked to my car with a sense of finality that felt both sad and liberating. I'd given them 3 weeks to acknowledge what they'd done, to take responsibility, to make amends. Instead, they'd sent Madison to manipulate me back into compliance with tears and guilt. It was exactly what I should have expected, and exactly why my decision to cut them off had been correct. As I drove home to my apartment, I realized that Madison's visit had actually been a gift, though not the kind she'd intended. It had confirmed that they hadn't learned anything from my withdrawal. They still saw this as a temporary tantrum that could be managed with the right combination of emotional manipulation and family pressure. They still didn't understand that. I was serious. But they were about to learn. 2 days after Madison's ambush at the hospital, my phone rang at 6:47 a.m. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the Arizona area code told me everything I needed to know. They'd gotten someone else to call me, probably hoping I'd answer if I didn't recognize the number. I let it go to voicemail and continued getting ready for my shift. When I checked the message later, it was exactly what I'd expected. Dad's voice, strained and formal, asking me to call him back about urgent family business. The phrase made me laugh. Everything was urgent with them when they weren't getting their way. The calls continued throughout the week, always from different numbers. Neighbors, family friends, even my old high school guidance counselor who somehow got dragged into their drama. Each message carried the same basic script. I was being unreasonable. The family was worried about me. Couldn't we all just sit down and work this out like adults? I deleted every message without responding. If they wanted to involve half of Phoenix in their campaign to guilt me back into compliance, that was their choice. But I wasn't going to justify my decision to protect my own financial security to people who only knew their version of events. The real escalation came on a Thursday evening when I arrived home from my shift to find my parents sitting in their car outside my apartment building. They'd been there long enough for the setting sun to cast long shadows across the parking lot, and something about their presence felt ominous rather than concerned. I parked my Honda in its usual spot and sat for a moment, watching them in my rearview mirror. Mom was gesturing animatedly while Dad stared straight ahead with the rigid posture of someone barely containing his anger. This wasn't going to be a gentle reconciliation attempt. They climbed out of their car as I approached the building entrance, moving with the coordinated precision of people who'd planned this confrontation carefully. Alexandra. Dad's voice carried the tone he'd used when I was in trouble as a child. We need to talk, Now. Actually, we don't, I replied, not slowing my pace toward the door. I told Madison that if you wanted to communicate with me, you could do it in writing. This is harassment. Harassment? Mom's voice pitched higher, the way it always did when she was building toward a dramatic outburst. We're your parents. We have every right to talk to our own daughter. I stopped walking and turned to face them, noting that several of my neighbors were starting to watch. The scene from their windows. These people didn't know my family history, didn't understand the context of this confrontation. To them, I probably looked like the unreasonable daughter refusing to speak to her worried parents. You had every right to talk to me 3 weeks ago before you spent my college fund, I said calmly. You chose not to exercise that right then. You don't get to demand it now. That money was sitting there doing nothing, Dad said, his face flushing red. Madison needed clothes for her career, and we knew you'd figure out another way to handle school. You always do. There it was, the casual dismissal of my sacrifice wrapped in a compliment about my competence. I always figured things out because I always had to. Because they'd spent my entire life taking from me and expecting me to manage. The consequences? Her career, I repeated. You mean her Instagram account where she posts pictures of the designer clothes you bought with my deployment earnings? Don't be so dramatic, Mom snapped. Social media marketing is a legitimate career path. Madison is building a brand, creating content, developing a following. Those clothes are business expenses. Business expenses. They'd convinced themselves that my stolen tuition money was an investment in Madison's pretend career. The rationalization was so complete, so detailed that I almost wondered if they actually believed it. Even if that were true, I said, it doesn't explain why you thought you had the right to spend money that wasn't yours without asking permission first. We're your parents, Mom said, as if that explained everything. We don't need permission to make decisions about family resources. You've been sending us money for 2 years, so clearly you understand that we all support each other in this family. Family resources. My combat pay had become a family resource in their minds, community property that they could allocate however they saw fit. The money I'd earned while dodging mortars and treating wounded soldiers was just another asset in their family portfolio. I sent you money to help with bills, I said. Temporary assistance during financial difficulties. I never agreed to fund Madison's shopping addiction indefinitely. Shopping addiction? Dad's voice rose dangerously. She bought a few nice things for her career. You're acting like she spent thousands of dollars on frivolous nonsense. She spent $6,800 on frivolous nonsense, I replied. Money that was specifically saved for my education. Money you took without permission. Money that represented 3 years of combat deployments. Money that was sitting in an account earning minimal interest while your sister needed help building. Her future, Mom shot back. We prioritized the family member who actually needed assistance. The admission hung in the air between us like a confession. They'd prioritized Madison's wants over my needs, her imaginary career over my actual education, her comfort over my future. And they'd done it consciously, deliberately, believing they had the right to make that choice. You prioritized the family. Member who couldn't be bothered to earn her own money, I corrected. The family member who's been living in your basement for 2 years while I've been working full-time and sending you hundreds of dollars every month? Madison is going through a difficult transition period, Mom said defensively. Not everyone can be as naturally independent as you are, Alexandra. Some people need more support while they find their path. Naturally independent. As if my self-reliance was an innate personality trait rather than a survival skill I'd developed in response to their neglect. As if I'd chosen to be the family's emotional and financial support system instead of being forced into that role by their favoritism. Madison is 22 years old with a college degree, I said. If she's still going through a transition period, maybe the solution is to stop enabling her dependence, not to steal from other family members to fund it. We didn't steal anything, Dad exploded, his voice echoing off the apartment buildings. around us. That money was going to waste in your account. We put it to good use helping your sister build something meaningful. The neighboring windows had more faces in them now, residents drawn by the shouting match in their parking lot. I could see phones being held up, probably recording the confrontation for entertainment or evidence. The last thing I needed was to become a viral video of family dysfunction. "You're going to lower your voice," I said quietly. "Or I'm going to call the police and report that you're harassing me at my residence." "Harassing you?" Mom's voice cracked with indignation. "We're trying to save this family. You're the one who's being unreasonable, cutting us off without warning, refusing to answer our calls, blocking our numbers like we're strangers." "You are strangers," I realized as I said it. "People who love me wouldn't steal from me. People who respect me wouldn't spend my money without asking. People who care about my future wouldn't jeopardize my education to fund someone else's shopping spree." "We love you more than anything," Mom said, tears starting to flow. "You're our daughter, our firstborn. Everything we've done has been for this family." "Everything you've done has been for Madison," I corrected. "I've been the family's unpaid financial advisor, emotional support system, and backup plan for 26 years. But I've never been the daughter you protected, supported, or prioritized." Dad stepped closer, his face twisted with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You're going to destroy this family over money. Is that really who you want to be? Someone who values dollars more than relationships?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about how they saw this situation. In their minds, I was choosing money over family. The fact that they'd chosen Madison's wants over my education didn't register as a comparable betrayal. My boundaries were the problem, not their theft. "I'm not destroying anything," I said, pulling out my phone. "I'm protecting myself from people who've demonstrated that they can't be trusted with access to my finances, and if you don't leave my property right now, I'm calling 911. They must have seen something in my expression that convinced them I was serious, because Dad grabbed Mom's arm and started pulling her toward their car. "This isn't over, Alexandra," he called back as they retreated. "Family doesn't abandon family, no matter how angry you are. We'll find a way to work through this." I watched them drive away, noting the license plate number out of habit. If they escalated to actual stalking or harassment, I wanted documentation of their behavior. But more than that, I wanted to remember this moment, the moment they revealed that they still didn't understand the gravity of what they'd done. They thought this was about anger that would eventually fade. They thought this was a family dispute that could be resolved with enough pressure and guilt. They thought I was having an emotional reaction that could be managed through their usual manipulation tactics. They still didn't realize that I'd made a strategic decision to remove toxic people from my life, regardless of our shared DNA. But they were about to learn the difference between temporary anger and permanent boundaries. The confrontation in the parking lot was the final straw. I'd given them every opportunity to acknowledge what they'd done, to take responsibility, to show even a hint of genuine remorse. Instead, they'd doubled down on their entitlement and escalated to harassment. It was time to make my boundaries legally enforceable. The next morning, I took a personal day from work and drove to the law offices of Martinez and Associates, a firm that specialized in family law and had good reviews for handling financial abuse cases. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, didn't seem surprised when I explained I needed to speak with someone about family members who'd stolen money from me. "Unfortunately, this is more common than people realize," she said, scheduling me an appointment with attorney Rebecca Martinez for that afternoon, especially with veterans who have savings from their military service. Attorney Martinez was a woman in her 40s with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible variation of family dysfunction. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes on a yellow legal pad as I explained the theft, the aftermath, and the escalating harassment. "Do you want to pursue criminal charges?" she asked when I finished. "What they did technically," constitutes felony theft in Arizona, since the amount exceeded $5,000. The question hung in the air between us. Criminal charges would mean police reports, court dates, potential jail time for my parents. It would make our family conflict a matter of public record, something that could never be taken back or forgiven. But it would also send a clear message that actions have consequences, even when those actions are committed by family members who believe love gives them unlimited access to your resources. I want to explore all my options, I said carefully, but my immediate concern is stopping the harassment and protecting my financial accounts from further unauthorized access. We can start with a cease and desist letter, she suggested. It's not legally binding, but it creates a paper trail and puts them on notice that their behavior constitutes harassment. If they continue, we can pursue a restraining order. We spent the next hour drafting a letter that laid out their actions in stark legal terms. The unauthorized access to my bank accounts, the theft of $6,800 earmarked for education, the attempted manipulation through third parties, the confrontation at my workplace and residence. Reading it back informal. Legal language made their behavior sound even worse than it had felt in the moment. These weren't the actions of concerned parents worried about their daughter. These were the actions of people who believed they were entitled to someone else's money and time. I want to send copies to all three of them, I told Attorney Martinez. My parents and my sister. Madison may not have initiated the theft, but she was the beneficiary, and she's been participating in the harassment campaign. Are you prepared for them to escalate further? The attorney asked. Sometimes families react badly to legal intervention. They may see it as a betrayal rather than a necessary boundary. I thought about that question as I signed the retainer. Agreement. Was I prepared for them to hate me? To paint me as the villain in their version of this story? To potentially cut me off from extended family members who might side with them? The answer was yes. I was prepared for all of that because I'd already lost the family I thought I had. The people who'd raised me, who I'd loved and sacrificed for, had revealed themselves to be something different than what I'd believed. They were people who saw my military service as their financial windfall, my savings as their emergency fund, my future as less important than their present comfort. Prepared, I told her. The letters went out that afternoon via certified mail, requiring signatures upon delivery. Within 48 hours, I had confirmation that all three had been received. The silence that followed was different from their previous attempts to guilt me back into compliance. This silence felt careful, calculated, like they were consulting their own legal counsel. Good. Let them understand that their actions had consequences beyond hurt feelings and family drama. Let them realize that theft doesn't stop being theft just because it's committed by relatives. I spent that weekend moving into my new apartment, a one-bedroom unit with actual closet space and a kitchen island where I could spread out my nursing textbooks. For the first time since my discharge, I was living somewhere that felt like home rather than a temporary way station. The difference in my stress levels was immediate and dramatic. No more jumping every time my phone buzzed, wondering, what family crisis required my intervention? No more checking my bank balance with anxiety about unauthorized withdrawals. No more calculating whether I could afford groceries after sending money home for other people's emergencies. I was finally living my own life, and it felt like breathing after years of holding my breath. The phone call came 3 weeks after the cease and desist letters were delivered at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. I was studying for my upcoming nursing program entrance exam when my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. After weeks of silence from my family, something about the late hour and unknown caller ID felt ominous. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up on the fourth ring. Alex? My mother's voice was barely a whisper, raw with tears and exhaustion. Please don't hang up. I'm calling from Linda's phone because I know you blocked mine. Linda Martinez, our next-door neighbor from when I was growing up. Even in crisis, My mother was finding ways around the boundaries I'd established. It's almost midnight, Mom. What's wrong? Everything's wrong, she sobbed into the phone. Everything is falling apart, and I don't know what to do anymore. Your father and we're in real trouble, Alex. Financial trouble. And now with those legal papers you sent. I remained silent, waiting for her to continue. In the background, I could hear Dad's voice, muffled but agitated, apparently coaching her on what to say. The credit cards are maxed out, she continued, her voice breaking. We got behind on the mortgage when your dad's hours were cut last month. The bank sent a notice about foreclosure proceedings. And now Madison, she's talking about moving to Los Angeles to pursue her influencer career, and she needs money for an apartment deposit and moving expenses. The absurdity would have been funny if it wasn't so tragic. They were facing foreclosure, but Madison still expected them to fund her move to LA for her imaginary career. We need help, Alex. We've always been able to count on you, and now you've cut us off completely. We don't know who else to turn to. You could turn to Madison, I said quietly. She's the one who benefited from my stolen tuition money. Maybe she could return some of those designer purchases to help with the mortgage. She can't do that! Mom's voice pitched higher with panic. Those clothes are part of her brand now. She's posted about them, worn them to events. Returning them would damage her online reputation. Her online reputation. Their house was in foreclosure, but protecting Madison's Instagram image was still the priority. Then maybe she could get a job, I suggested. Like most people do when they need money. You don't understand, Mom said desperately. Madison isn't. Like you. She's not as strong, not as naturally capable. She needs support while she builds her career. She can't just work at some minimum wage job like a regular person. There it was again, the fundamental belief that Madison was special, delicate, deserving of a life without struggle while I was expected to handle whatever hardships came my way. What exactly are you asking me to do? I said. Come home, she pleaded. Let's sit down as a family and work this out. You're so good with finances, so good at solving problems. Help us figure out how to save the house. Help Madison get established in LA. Help us get back on our feet. Help, help, help. Even in their desperate hour, they saw me as a resource to be deployed, not a daughter whose own needs and boundaries mattered. I can't do that, I said simply. Can't or won't. Dad's voice came through clearly now, apparently having taken the phone from Mom. Because there's a difference, Alexandra. This is your family, your childhood home. Are you really going to let everything fall apart because of money? I'm not letting anything fall apart, I replied. You created this situation with your financial choices. You prioritized Madison's shopping spree over fiscal responsibility. You chose to fund her lifestyle instead of protecting your own housing security. We made a mistake, he admitted, his voice strained. Maybe we shouldn't have used your college money without asking. But families forgive mistakes. Families help each other through difficult times. A mistake. After weeks of justifying their theft as wise family resource allocation, it was suddenly a mistake now that they needed something from me. Families also don't steal from each other, I said. Families don't dismiss one daughter's education to fund another daughter's shopping. Addiction. Families don't harass members who establish reasonable boundaries. Those legal papers. Mom's voice came back on the line, tearful and accusatory. How could you threaten your own parents with lawyers? We raised you, sacrificed for you, loved you unconditionally. Love isn't unconditional when it depends on my willingness to be exploited, I replied. And you didn't sacrifice for me. You sacrificed me for Madison, over and over, for 26 years. The silence on the other end stretched, long enough that I wondered if they'd hung up. We're going to lose everything, Mom finally whispered. The house, our credit, our family. Is that what you want? I want you to take responsibility for your choices, I said. I want you to stop expecting me to fix problems you created. Want you to treat Madison like the adult she is instead of enabling her dependency. We can't do this without you, Dad said, his voice breaking. You're the strong one, the capable one. You're the only one who can help us through this. Even in their desperation, they couldn't see me as anything other than a tool for solving their problems. My strength wasn't valued for my own benefit. It was valued for theirs. You're going to have to learn, I said gently. Good luck. I hung up and turned off my phone, sitting in the quiet of my new apartment. The conversation had been painful, but not in the way they'd intended. It wasn't painful because I felt guilty for refusing to help. It was painful because it confirmed everything I'd realized about our family dynamics. They still didn't understand what they'd done wrong. They still saw me as the family emergency fund. They still believed Madison deserved special treatment, while I deserved nothing but expectations. The foreclosure, the financial crisis, the family falling apart, none of it was my responsibility to fix. For the first time in my adult life, I was free to focus on my own future instead of managing theirs. It felt like finally learning to breathe. 2 years passed like pages turning in a book I was finally writing for myself. The nursing program had been everything I'd hoped for, and more challenging than I'd expected. Balancing full-time classes with part-time work at the VA hospital and my work-study position in veteran services pushed me to my limits. But it was the kind of exhaustion that came from building something rather than maintaining someone else's chaos. My clinical rotations had been particularly meaningful. Working with trauma patients, I'd found myself drawing on experiences from my military service in ways that made me a better nurse. The ability to stay calm under pressure, to make quick decisions in life or death situations, to connect with patients who'd experienced combat. These skills felt like a bridge between my past and future selves. I'd graduated magna cum laude 6 months ago and immediately been offered a full-time position in the emergency department at Phoenix General Hospital. The pay was substantially better than my VA job, and for the first time since my discharge, I was living comfortably on my own income without constantly calculating whether I could afford basic necessities. My new apartment had become a sanctuary. I'd furnished it slowly, thoughtfully, choosing pieces that reflected my own taste rather than accepting whatever was cheapest or most practical. The walls were decorated with photos from my deployments, not the traumatic memories, but the moments of camaraderie and accomplishment that had defined my military service. Sarah visiting during her leave, Marcus at his promotion ceremony, the medical team I'd worked with in Kandahar after we'd saved a young Afghan girl who'd been caught in crossfire. These were my real family photos now. The silence from my biological family had been complete since that midnight phone call 2 years ago. No birthday cards, no holiday messages, no emergency calls claiming they needed my help. At first, the absence had felt strange, like missing the phantom pain from an amputated limb, but gradually the quiet had become peaceful rather than empty. I'd built a life surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. Sarah had been stationed at Luke Air Force Base for the past year, and we'd fallen into a routine of weekly dinners and hiking trips in the desert mountains. Marcus had finished his engineering degree and moved to Denver, but we stayed in touch through video calls and an ongoing group chat with other veterans from our unit. My co-workers at the hospital had become genuine friends. Dr. Jennifer Kim, the attending physician who'd mentored me through my transition from VA tech to emergency nurse. James Rodriguez, a fellow veteran who worked in radiology and understood the unique challenges of translating military experience into civilian healthcare. Maria Santos, a trauma counselor who'd helped me process some of the guilt I'd carried about leaving my family behind. It was Maria who'd helped me understand that my family's financial crisis hadn't been my responsibility to solve. You can't save people who don't want to be saved, she'd told me during one of our sessions. And you can't love people into treating you with respect. I'd also reconnected with some extended family members who'd reached out after learning about the situation through Phoenix's surprisingly active family gossip network. My father's sister, Aunt Carmen, had called me about 6 months after I'd cut contact with my parents. She'd wanted to hear my side of the story, she said, because the version she'd gotten from my mother didn't sound like the niece she remembered. "I always wondered why you seemed so stressed every time I saw you," she'd admitted during our coffee meeting. "You were working constantly, never seemed to have money for anything fun, but I knew you had a good job. Now it makes sense." Carmen had filled me in on some family history I'd never known. Apparently, my parents had struggled with money management throughout their marriage, frequently borrowing from relatives and rarely paying them back. My mother's parents had eventually cut them off financially after years of emergency loans that were never repaid. "Your grandmother used to say that your parents treated family money like government assistance. They thought they were entitled to it," Carmen had explained. "When you started sending money home from your deployments, I wondered how long it would take them to start seeing you the same way they'd seen the rest of us, like a bank they never had to pay back." The conversation had been both validating and heartbreaking. Validating because it confirmed that the patterns I'd identified weren't figments of my imagination. Heartbreaking because it revealed how long my parents had been using family relationships as financial instruments. Through Carmen, I'd learned that my parents had indeed lost the house to foreclosure about 8 months after our last phone call. They'd moved into a small rental in a less expensive part of town. Dad had found another job, but at significantly reduced pay. Madison had never made it to Los Angeles. Apparently, the reality of actually funding her own move had been too daunting when their other financial support systems collapsed. "Madison's working at a boutique in Scottsdale now," Carmen had told me. "First job she's ever had. Your mother complains constantly about how unfair it is that Madison has to work retail when she has a college degree. But at least she's finally contributing to household expenses." The information had stirred up complicated emotions. Part of me felt vindicated that my withdrawal from their financial ecosystem had forced them all to face reality. But another part of me felt sadness for the struggles they were experiencing, even though I knew those struggles were the natural consequences of their choices. Most importantly, though, I felt peace. The life I'd built without them was fuller, healthier, and more authentic than anything I'd experienced while trapped in their dysfunctional system. I'd learned to value myself the way they never had, to prioritize my own growth and happiness without guilt. I was no longer the backup daughter, the family ATM, or the emergency emotional support system. I was simply Alexandra Rodriguez, emergency, room nurse, veteran, friend, and for the first time in my life, that felt like enough. The email arrived on a quiet Sunday morning, exactly 3 years after I'd walked out of my childhood home. The subject line read, "From Madison, please read." Almost deleted it, but curiosity won. Madison's message was different from the desperate manipulation attempts I'd grown accustomed to. It was simple, direct, and for the first time in her life, accountable. "Alex, I know I have no right to contact you, but I needed you to know that. I finally understand what we did to you. Working at the boutique taught me what it actually means to earn money. Living paycheck to paycheck taught me what financial stress feels like. Watching Mom and Dad struggle taught me that money doesn't just appear magically in bank accounts. I've saved up enough to pay you back. Not the full amount yet, but it's a start. I'm enclosing a check for $2,400. I know it doesn't fix what we did, and I'm not asking for forgiveness or a relationship. I just wanted you to know that you were right, and I'm sorry it took me 3 years to grow up enough to admit it." The check was real. I stared at it for a long time, remembering the girl who'd once told me I was being dramatic about money. This Madison, the one who'd learned the value of earning her own way, felt like a stranger. I didn't cash the check immediately. Instead, I put it in my desk drawer and thought about the woman I'd become in those 3 years of silence. Strong, independent, surrounded by people who truly valued me. The money was never really about the money. It was about respect, boundaries, and choosing myself for the first time in my life. Some battles are worth fighting, even when they cost you everything you thought was family. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of courage, boundaries, and choosing yourself.